Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Good morning, my dear students. Today we shall complete our discussion regarding two penal treatments. In previous lecture, we began our discussion in such regard. We discussed certain types of penal treatment, and we distinguished between penal treatment and alternatives. We discussed probation as an alternative, and we distinguish between probation and parole. Today we shall complete our discussion in such regard. We shall discuss certain types of early release. Conditional release consider a figure or a part of or figure of early release. The early release, conditional release, consider penal treatment. Early release. Regarding to early release, there are several special forms of early release in addition to those already discussed. Because presumed overcrowding or particularly according to health capacity of the prisons, because of presumed crowding, consider the major problem. Many countries have authorized release of inmates earlier than usual to control such overcrowding, to control prison population. In fact, in legislations, there are three types of early release. Three types of early release are generally designated as emergency release, sentence reduction, and early parole. Regarding to emergency release permits the release of inmates who are approaching the end of their sentences. Again, emergency release. In emergency release, the inmate, could permit to release before or who are approaching the end of him or her sentence. Typically, those within 4 or 5 months of discharge may be released in countries who's having this provision or whom applied such system. And certain jurisdictions use sentence reduction to lower prison population. Such approach usually requires a formal declaration that the prison system is above its authorized capacity. If such occurs, sentence of selected inmates, such as terrorist offenders or non-violent offenders, may be reduced by up to 90 days. The length or the required length or minimum length depend or based upon the rules which set in the jurisdiction or legislation. Our jurisdictions allow early parole by advancing release dates to be advanced for certain categories of offenders when prisons are overcrowded. Such programs may involve a period of more intensive supervision by a parole officer or participation in special or specific community-based correctional programs. Regarding to liability of one of the early release programs determined according to the following criteria or following conditions. The first one, the type of sentence. Second rule, the good time credit the defendant or inmate earned when he will serve his penalty. The third condition, regarding to how much good time credit the defendant or inmate had earned. Released from prisons before serving full or maximum sentence may also take place in two other ways. The first one, clemency, and the second one, compassionate release. Clemency means the power of execute authority. For example, the governor of the state to change the sentence of the defendant to prevent injustice, for example, while compassionate release means a program for releasing time, or seriously ill prisoners. Clemency and compassionate release are in legislations harder to obtain than conditional or early or presumptive release, which we shall discuss within few minutes. اتكلمنا في المحاضرة اللي فاتت يا أولاد عن البرول، وقلنا ده شكل من أشكال أو صورة من صور المعاملة أو أساليب المعاملة العقابية. واتكلمنا على الرولز بتاعته، اتكلمنا على البوليسيز. اوكي، لكن عندنا كمان صور كتير، صور أخرى في بعض التشريعات اللي من بينها الإفراج المبكر، الإفراج في حالات معينة، في حالات الطوارئ، تخفيض مدة العقوبة، وهنا ما بيكونش بواسطة الحكم القضائي ولكن بواسطة السلطة المعنية، سواء البار اوفيسرز او الجفرنر اوف ذا ستيت، وقلنا زي حالات العفو عن العقوبة. كل النظم دي بتطبق في التشريعات اللي عندها مشكلة في تكدس السجون، وخصوصا لما معدلات التكدس بتبقى اوفركم الهيلث كاباسيتي او ما يطلق عليه السعة الصحية للسجن. بتطبق اي نظام من هذه الانظمه، عشان المفروض، عشان احنا قلنا الايرلي ريليز كونديشنال ريليز بيكون الغرض الاساسي منه ان احنا يعني لما نعمل ري انتجريشن للانميت يكون جرادولي، عشان كده خروجه لازم يكون جرادولي. اما هنا بيكون الغرض الاساسي ان هو يعني يعالج مشكله تكدس السكر. طيب، السؤال هنا: هل كل سجين له هذا الحق؟ يعني يطبق عليه هذا النظام؟ لا، ده مش حق. يعني ايه؟ مش زيه زي الشروط او الضوابط التي يجب ان تطبق لاصدار الحكم. لا، ده هنا لازم يكون عشان الافراج المشروط او الايرلي ريليز او كل ده لازم يكون under certain conditions زي ما قلنا قبل كده. ايه الكونديشنز دي؟ الكونديشنز دي متعلقه بنوع العقوبه زي ما اتكلمنا في المحاضره اللي فاتت، وهنتكلم في المحاضره دي ونشوف الكونديشن الريليز في القانون المصري يطبق على نوعيه معينه من الجرائم. يعني في جرائم زي الاتجار في المواد المخدره، زي جرائم الارهاب، تجمهر والتظاهر، لا يطبق عليها بحكم القانون نظام الافراج الشرطي القانون المصري. كمان سلوكه خلال فتره السجن، الكود تايم كريدت، اللي هو طبعا آه، اللي بناء عليه هو سلوك خلال فتره السجن، اللي انا بناء عليه كمؤسسه عقابيه بديله الجود تايم كريدت. والجود تايم كريدت دي طبعا كريدت زي الجي بي اي كده، اي بي سي دي، بناء عليها في هذا النظام بتتحدد مده الافراج هتبقى بعد قد ايه. يعني في التشريعات اللي بتطبق هذه الانظمه على اختلاف انماطها بتحدد فقط الحد الادنى لمده العقوبه التي يجب ان يكون النزيل او السجين قضاها عشان يبقى مؤهل لتطبيق هذا النظام. يعني على سبيل المثال في التشريع المصري كان الحد الادنى ده ثلاث ارباع المده، ثم ثلثين المده، ثم صار نص المده في اخر تعديل تشريعي. طيب، هل معنى كده ان بعد نص المده مصلحه السجون ملزمه انها تفرج عن الشخص ده؟ لا، ممكن تفرج عنه بعد 40%، بعد 30%، بعد 10%. اوكي، ده يختلف عن نظام العفو اللي بيصدر من رئيس الدوله او من الجفرنر على حسب التشريع ايا ما كان. اوكي، يصدر من السلطه التنفيذيه اللي هو لا يخضع لهذه المعايير، ويختلف عن نظام الافراج الصحي زي اللي طبق مثلا على هشام طلعت مصطفى، زي اللي طبق على نخنوخ وامثاله. افراج الصحي يفرج عنه استثناء لظروف صحيه، ده ملوش علاقه بالجود تايم كريدت. يعني سواء سلوكه داخل السجن كان آه كويس وكان ممتاز للتعليمات او لا، هنا بيطبق بيطبق هذا النظام حتى لو ما كانش هنا في جود تايم كريدت. طيب، نيجي بعد كده ل definite و determinate و indeterminate sentence. Um, in fact, there are three types of sentences: definite, determinate, and indeterminate. وهنشوف الايرلي ريليز بيطبق ازاي في هذه التايبس اوف criminal penalties. Indefinite sentences. Oh, definite sentence refer to fixed term, and based upon classical ideology ليس punishment في the crime. Indefinite sentence set by law. So, judge's discretion about in such a case shall be limited. So, definite sentence is for fixed term. That is specific type of and specific type and specific length. For example, if the defendant were convicted with a felony murder and received a sentence for 10 years, then the sentence considered definite. While indeterminate, we said that indeterminate sentence, an indeterminate sentence which is based upon correctional ideology, the type of sentence given to the person, convicted person of most types of violent crimes, drug felons, sex offenses felons, a determinate sentence is for fixed term. For example, if the defendant were convicted with a violent misdemeanor and received 2 years of sentence, then the sentence is be determined. While definite sentence cannot exceed 1 year, the maximum determined sentence may be 2 years. While in indeterminate sentence, the type of sentence given if the defendant are convicted of crime not requiring a determinate sentence. That indeterminate sentence is not for fixed period of time. Instead, is a range of time that includes maximum term, for example, at least 1 year, or a maximum term for at least 3 years, but can be as much as life imprisonment. For example, a sentence for 5 to 10 years. And an indeterminate sentence where the minimum term is 5 years and the maximum term is 10 years. Defendant must serve maximum term of indeterminate sentence if there is no reduction to the defendant's sentence or the defendant are not paroled. An indeterminate sentence is generally served in state or central prisons. It's important to determine what type of sentence or sentences which the defendant serving, because the rules for when and how defendant can become eligible for early release are different for each of the 3 types of sentence. اتكلمنا وقلنا ان عندنا definite وعندي determinate وعندي indeterminate. في الdefinite sentence زي ما قلنا العقوبة بتبقى محددة في القانون، وطبعا القاضي بيطبق العقوبة اللي هي منصوص عليها في القانون. لو اتحكم عليه مثلا ب10 سنين ينفذ ال10 سنين. اما في الديترمنت يقصد بها نوع العقوبة اللي بيصدر على الاشخاص المدانين بمعظم الجرائم العنيفة، جرائم المخدرات، جرائم العنف وجرائم المخدرات وجرائم الجنسية والعقوبات اللي بتبقى محددة المدة. على سبيل المثال إذا أدين الديفندنت بفايلنس كرايم وحكم عليه بالسجن لمدة عامين، فإن هنا العقوبة هتبقى محددة معروفة. أما في الانديترمنت، وإحنا قلنا الانديترمنت في البينولوجي دي بتشير الى الى type of penalty in which the type of sentence is included in criminal verdict while the length of sentence passed to paramount officers. ليه؟ لان هم القاضي، وهو دي فلسفتهم، انه وقت ما بيصدر العقوبه الحكم ما هوش oriented بالاوبتيمال تايم needed for rehabilitation. وبالتالي في الانديترمينت سنتنس مفيش مده محدده، لكن البارل بورد اوفيسرز عندهم حد ادنى وحد اقصى. وقت ما الراجل ده يتم اصلاحه او تاهيله، طبعا دي مش موجوده عندنا في التشريع المصري، ولكن في بعض التشريعات اللي بتاخد بهذا النظام. في الانديترمينت سنتنس مفيش تخفيف ومفيش افراج مشروط، مفيش ايرلي ريليز، عكس الديفنت. ليه؟ لان هنا مده العقوبه بتتحدد على حسب الاوبتيمال تايم نيدد فور ريهابيليتيشن. وبالتالي مفيش تخفيف ومفيش افراج ايه؟ ومفيش افراج مشروط. طيب، ماذا عن الجود تايم كريدت اللي احنا اتكلمنا عليها من شويه؟ الجود تايم كريدت refer to a credit that the defendant may be earned in prison for good behavior. ودي بتطبق سواء في الايرلي ريليس، دي واحده من اهم certain conditions for liability of release. اي ما كان التايب، conditional release، early release، هنا ده واحده من اهم الكونديشنز الجود تايم كريدت، واللي بتقوم على his or her good behavior within serving criminal penalty. So if the defendant were serving definite sentence and earn good time credit, he could use such credit to shorten his sentence. ده بالنسبة لنظام good time credit. Good time credit. On another hand, if the defendant were serving either determinate or indeterminate sentence and earns good time credit, he could use such credit to obtain conditional release. You had to note that, however, if the defendant were serving indeterminate sentence with a maximum term or life imprisonment, or an indeterminate sentence, that is a sentence only requiring that defendant be in jail on certain days of the week، السيستم اللي يطلق عليه weekend penalty، or certain hours of that day, he may be shall ineligible for good time credit, depend or based upon the legislation's governing rules. الجود تايم كريدت هو ده كريدت، خلي بالكم هي سواء الجود تايم كريدت او الكونديشنال ريليز او الايرلي ريليز، دي انظمه بتعتمد على الجود بيهيفير، سلوكه خلال فتره تطبيق العقوبه زي ما كنت بقول من شويه. اوكي، في الجود تايم كريدت اذا كان هو خد ايرن جود تايم كريدت، فهنا في الانظمه اللي بتاخد بهذا النظام بيبقى من حقه ان ياخد بونص. ايه البونص ده؟ ان هو تقل فتره العقوبه، ما بيطلعش بقى تحت كونديشنال ريليز. يقل فتره العقوبه بالبونص، وده الفرق بين الجود تايم كريدت وفرق بين الكونديشنال ريليز او الايرلي ريليز. هنا ده شكل من اشكال الايرلي ريليز، لكن في بعض التشريعات بيكون هنا فاينل ريليز. اوكي. لكن الجود تايم كريدت في الكونديشنال ريليز ده بيخلي فيه الابيليتي فور conditional release. conditional release. طيب، عندي فيجر تاني او شكل تاني اللي هو presumptive release. لما جينا نتكلم على الايرلي ريليز وقلنا ان الايرلي ريليز are certain type of conditional release in which inmates earns release before serving the maximum penalty. طب ال presumptive release or difference between presumptive release and early release. Both of them are other ways in which defendant can be released from prison before serving a full penalty. But presumptive release is available to a defendant if he were serving one or more indeterminate sentence for non-violent crimes. A defendant didn't commit any serious disciplinary violations, and in the case when the defendant hadn't filled uh, content, legal claims. Presumptive release works like parole and conditional release, but unlike such programs, parole or conditional release, it allows defendant to leave prison without appearing before parole board. عندي شكل تاني اللي هو البريزمتيف ريليز. ايه الفرق بين البريزمتيف ريليز والايرلي ريليز؟ كلاهما يتشابه في ان هما وسيلتين من خلالهم بنفرج عن الراجل ده قبل انتهاء فتره العقوبه. لكن البريزمتيف ريليز في التشريعات اللي بتطبق هذا النظام له شروط اخرى. ايه هي الشروط دي؟ اولها انه ما يكونش الجريمه من الفايلنس كرايمز، من جرائم العنف، وانه ما يكونش ارتكب مخالفه تاديبيه جسيمه. اوكي. ولكن بيختلف عن الايرلي ريليز وعن الكونديشنال ريليز، ان الايرلي ريليز والكونديشنال ريليز زي ما احنا اتكلمنا من شويه وزي ما هنشوف بعد شويه، في كوميتي يجب ان يعرض عليها الكيس وهي اللي تدي الديسيجن. فهو هنا بيعرض على البير بورت اوفيسرز او البير بورت كوميتي. اما في البريزمتيف ريليز لا، ما بيعرضش عليه. طيب، regarding to good time credit, how, question is, how can defendant earn good time credit? Defendant could earn good time credit for good behavior and efficient and willing performance of duties assigned to him, either in prison or for progress and achievement in assigned treatment program. On another hand, a defendant could lose good time credit for bad behavior, violation of institutional rules, or failure to perform properly any duties programs assigned to him in prison. If the defendant fails to complete a recommendation or recommended program, prison official in such case may also withhold good time credit. Defendant doesn't has a right again. Huh? Defendant doesn't have a right to earn good time credit. In another meaning, prison officials are not required to give him good time credit, are not obliged to earn him good time credit. But if prison officials think that, okay, the defendant or the inmate behavior in prison is acceptable, they will probably grant him good time credit. So good time credit is not considered a right, an inmate right, but issuance of decision in such a case based upon discretionary power of parole board officers or prisons officials. الصوت طيب معلش عشان انا. طب هنعيدها تاني. هنعيدها تاني. طيب good time credit defendant. الصوت واضح كده يا اولاد؟ الصوت واضح؟ طيب انا هعيد الجزء ده تاني عشان فعلا كان المايك مقفول عندي. طيب فكنا بنتكلم على الجود تايم كريدت. How can defendant earn good time credit? Defendant could earn good time credit for good behavior and efficient and willing performance of duties assigned to him either in prison or programs and achievement in an assigned treatment program. On another hand, defendant can lose good time credit for bad behavior or violation of institutional rules or failure to perform properly any duties or programs assigned to him in prison. If the defendant failed to complete a recommended program, prison officials may also withhold good time credit. Defendant doesn't has a right to get good time credit. In other words, prison officials are not required to grant him good time credit. But if prison officials think that the defendant's behavior in prison are acceptable, are acceptable, they will probably grant him good time credit. Defendant could earn good time credit only when he were in prison and not in a parole, for example, conditional release, or under conditional release, or under supervised release. In most jurisdictions, prisons don't have to accept credits that inmate earned in different state prison, federal state prisons or federal prisons. Depending on the type of sentence which the defendant will serve, the defendant could use good time credit to shorten his sentence and earn unconditional release, or in the case of determinate or indeterminate, could get conditional release. الجود تايم كريدت اتكلمنا عليه. الجود تايم كريدت ده بيعتمد على بعض الكرايتيريا وبعض الكونديشنز. اللي اولها سلوكه خلال فتره سجن، مدى اتباعه للقواعد والتعليمات، مدى اتباعه للرولز، مدى تفاعله مع البروجرامز اللي هي مخصصه لكوركشنال بروجرامز او تريتمنت بروجرامز على حسب الاحوال، زي الانفورسد ثيرابي في حاله الادكشن، في حاله الادمان. كل ده بيكون هو الكرايتيريا اللي بناء عليه هو بياخد جود تايم كريدت ولا ما بياخدش جود تايم كريدت، وبياخد ايه، الجريد بتاعه ايه. اوكي. وزي ما قلنا ده على حسب التشريع، هل هو بيديله في جريدز A B C D مثلا، او ان هو يجي يقول والله طبعا هو ده بيعتمد على ايه، على ايفالويشن في ايتمز، يعني سلوكه مثلا خلال فترة السجن، تعامله مع زملائه، تعامله مع إدارة السجن، استجابته للبرامج الإصلاحية مثلا زي برنامج علاجه من الإدمان، برنامج علاج نفسي، أوكي. كل دي ايتمز بياخد عليها درجات، وفي النهاية بيجمعه وبيشوف التوتال بتاعه كام، ويشوف التوتال ده هل touched the minimum limit for earning good time credit ولا لا؟ أو earning conditional release أو shorten sentence ولا لا؟ وبالتالي الجود تايم كريدت بيستخدم يا اما في تقصير مده العقوبه في بعض البلدان او بعض التشريعات اللي بتدي بونص للشخص المسجون، انه لو خد فعلا المينيمم ليميت وخد جود تايم كريدت او خد كانت الجي بي اي بتاعته كان مثلا خد جريد كذا، خد المينيمم كذا، يطبق هنا شورتن اوف سنتنس. يعني الفرق بين شورتن اوف سنتنس وكونديشنال ريليز ان الشورتن اوف سنتنس يعتبر هنا فاينل ريليز قبل انتهاء مده العقوبه، او انه يطبق عليه نظام الكونديشنال ريليز، او يطبق عليه نظام الكونديشنال ريليز. طيب الجود تايم كريدت indefinite sentences. If the defendant were serving definite sentence and the owns good time credit, prison officials will use such credit to shorten, either shorten the defendant's sentence or to decide if or and when he could be eligible for conditional or early release على حسب السيستم المطبق. It's a process where prison officials decide whether to grant to defendant or inmate good time credit depend or based upon type of facility in which inmate served his penalty, and if the defendant were serving definite sentence, prison officials shall decide whether to give him good, good time credit or not. زي ما قلنا ان ده ما يعتبرش مش رايت ليه ولا اوبليجيشن للبريزن اوفيشالز، ولكن هنا بيكون placed under the discretionary power of prison officials. طيب good time credit from in indeterminate and indeterminate sentence. احنا اتكلمنا على الجود تايم كريدت and definite sentence، هنتكلم على الجود تايم كريدت in either indeterminate or indeterminate sentence. If the defendant were serving a determinate or indeterminate sentence and get or earned good time credit, prison officials will use such credit to decide whether he or she are eligible for conditional release. Unlike for definite sentence, if the defendant were serving and either determinate or indeterminate sentence, he could not use such credit to shorten his sentence or earn conditional release. How much good time credit the defendant can or amount of good time credit which defendant or inmate may earn based upon or depend on type of sentence he or she served. Good time for definite sentence. Good time for definite sentence. If the defendant were serving a definite sentence, the maximum good time credit, maximum good time credit, which he could earn is half, one third of his sentence. It depends on the governing or the relevant rules, which set an relevant article of the law. For example, if the defendant were serving definite sentence of 15 years or 15 days, maximum good time credit which the defendant may earn may be 5 days or 5 years. If the defendant was serving consecutive definite sentence, defendant can earn good time credit equal to half to half or one third of his total length of the sentence of combined sentence, depend on the governing rules. For example, if the defendant were serving two 15 days sentence consequently, the maximum good time credit which the inmate could be earned maybe 7 or 10 days. Good time credit for single determinate or indeterminate sentence. If the defendant was serving single determinate or indeterminate sentence, he could get good time credit, for example, as long as the maximum time is not a life imprisonment, depend on the governing rules. If the defendant was serving a determinate sentence, the maximum good time credit he could earn is, for example, 1/7 of the sentence depend on the governing rules. For example, if the defendant were serving determinate sentence of 21 years, the maximum good time credit could earn maybe 3 years. And if the defendant were serving an indeterminate sentence, the maximum good time which he could be earned is depend on the governing rules. For example, if the defendant were serving an indeterminate sentence of 15 to 30 years, the maximum good time credit that he could be earned may be 2 years. The calculation is more complicated if the defendant was serving more than one sentence as shown below. المدة اللي هيمنحها او اللي هياخدها في الجود تايم كريدت هتختلف اذا كانت العقوبه ديفينيت ولا انديترمينت، وزي ما قلنا كمان هتختلف اذا كانت العقوبه تختلف على حسب النص اللي بيحكم هذا الامر. هنتكلم دلوقتي ان شاء الله عن الجود تايم كريدت for either single or single determinate or indeterminate sentence. In legislations which set and applied such type of programs, if the defendant were serving a single determinate or indeterminate sentence, in such a case, he shall receive good time credit. For example, as long as the maximum term is not life imprisonment, depend on the governing rules. If the defendant was serving determinate sentence, the maximum good time credit which he could earn, for example, is 1/7 of his or her sentence, depend on the governing rules. For example, if the defendant were serving a determinate sentence for 21 years, the maximum good time credit which he could earn may be 3 years. 3 years is 1/7 of 21 years. If the defendant were serving an indeterminate sentence, the maximum good time credit which he could earn is depend on the governing rules. For example, if the defendant were serving indeterminate sentence of 15 to 30 years, maximum good time credit that he could earn may be 10 years. 1/3 of 30 of 30. As a 30 years is the maximum limit of indeterminate sentence. The calculation is more complicated if that shall be more complicated if the defendant were serving more than one sentence. So, good time credit for concurrent determinate sentence if the defendant were serving more than one determinate sentence concurrently at the same time. The maximum good time credit that he may be earned is depend on the governing rules. For example, if the defendant were serving one determinate sentence of 7 years and second determinate sentence for 14 years, the maximum good time credit which he or that he may be earned may be 2 years, 1/7 of the longer 14-year sentence. In such case, if the defendant earns maximum credit of 2 years, he shall be entitled to conditional release after serving, for example, 12 years of sentence. In other words, at that point, the defendant's 2 years credit would equal the amount of time he had left to serve. Good time credit for consecutive determinate sentence. If the defendant was serving more than one determinate sentence consecutively, one after the other, the maximum good time credit that he could earn is also depend on the governing rules. For example, if the defendant was serving a 7-year sentence and 14-year sentence consecutively, the maximum good time credit that or which he may be earned may be 3 years, as 3 years consider 1/7 of 21 years, the combined length of 2 years. In such example, if the defendant earns the maximum good time credit of 3 years, he shall be entitled to conditional release after serving 18 years of the sentence. That is the total time of sentence minus the maximum credit time. Credit time for consecutive indeterminate sentence. If the defendant were serving more than one indeterminate sentence consecutively, the maximum good time credit that he could earn may be 1/3 of the combined maximum terms. For example, if the defendant were serving 2 consecutive indeterminate sentences, one sentence for 1 to 3 years and another were for 3 to 6 years, the maximum good time credit that he could earn may be 3 years. And 3 years consider 1/3 of the total maximum sentence of 9 years. In such a case, if the defendant earns the maximum credit time, which he shall be entitled to release after 6 years, as 6 years is a total of the maximum sentence minus the maximum credit. while the good time credit for combined, concurrent, determinate, and indeterminate sentence, if the defendant were serving one or more determinate or one or more indeterminate sentence, the maximum good time credit that he may be earned is either 1/7 of the last ending determinate sentence or 1/3 of the maximum term of the last ending indeterminate sentence. It depends on the governing rules. For example, suppose that the defendant was serving the determinate sentence, okay, for 14 years at the same time as an indeterminate sentence of 6 to 9 years. He could earn either 1/7 of determinate sentence as 1/7 of 14 years, which is 2 years, or 1/3 of indeterminate sentence as 1/3 of 9 years, which is the 3 years. It based upon the governing rules, since the allowance of indeterminate sentence 3 years is larger than the allowance of determinate sentence 2 years. The maximum good time credit is that the defendant could earn maybe 3 years in such case. If the defendant earned the maximum credit, he shall be entitled to conditional release after 11 years, as the determined sentence of the 14 years minus the maximum credit of 3 years. Good time credit for combined, consecutive, determinate, and indeterminate sentence if the defendant were serving one or more determinate sentence and one or more indeterminate sentence in the same time. Consequent. The maximum good time credit that he could earn in such a case may be 1/3 of the maximum term of indeterminate sentence added together, plus 1/7 of the term of indeterminate sentence added together. For example, suppose that the inmate were serving a determinate sentence for 14 years consecutively with an indeterminate sentence of 6 to 9 years. The defendant in such case can earn up to years of credit time of good time credit from the determinate sentence 1/7 of the 14 and up to 3 years of good time credit for indeterminate sentence 1/3 of the 9. If the defendant receives the maximum credit of 5 years, he, in such a case, he shall be entitled to conditional release after 18 years, as 18 years is a total of defendant maximum sentence is 23 years minus the total of defendant's good time credit 5 years. طيب اتكلمنا عن الجود تايم كريدت وقلنا الجود تايم كريدت ممكن يمنح سواء كان في نظام الشورتنج اوف سنتنس او الكونديشنال ريليز لكن الجود تايم كريدت ازاي بنحسبه؟ وخصوصا اذا كان عندي العقوبه definite او determined او indeterminate. ده بيتحدد على حسب القواعد المنصوص عليها في التشريع. اوكي، فمثلا اذا كان الحد الاقصى مثلا لمده العقوبه، يعني بيقضي مده عقوبه مدتها 7 سنين مثلا، وعقوبة تانية مدتها 14 سنة، فهنا هيكون الحد الأقصى للجود تايم كريدت 7 سنين. العقوبة الأطول، العقوبة الأطول ل أو ال7 سنين هو الحد الأدنى للعقوبة، زي إذا كان الجود تايم كريدت هنا نص المدة، هيبقى 7 سنين لل 14 سنة، هو بيقضي عقوبتين. هناخد العقوبة الأعلى وندي الحد الأقصى للجود تايم كريدت عليها. طيب لو هو تلتين، يعني لو المشرع نص على تلتين، هتبقى هنا هيطبق تلتين، يبقى تلتين ل 14. طب لو تلت يبقى تلت ل 14، لو نص يبقى نص ل 14، وهكذا. طيب لما تكون العقوبة consecutive، يعني بيقضي أكتر من حكم في عقوبة consecutive، وكلاهما indeterminate. الحد الأقصى للكريدت هنا هو تلت أو نص أو تلتين أو تلات أرباع على حسب المدة المحددة في التشريع للحد الأقصى للعقوبات دي كلها، ده إذا كانت indeterminate. طيب وهكذا بيتم حساب الحد الأقصى للكريدت على حسب نوع العقوبة، definite، determinate، indeterminate، على حسب الحد الأدنى اللي ممكن يطبق عليه النظام، ثلاث أرباع، تلتين، تلت، وده طبعا على حسب النص، على حسب النص. طيب نيجي بعد كده، للpotential changes in law and how such changes affect at the defendant sentence. Suppose that the defendant state government passes a new law, okay, to reduce good time credit that inmate could have received under the older law. Inmate in such a case, if the inmates of it, okay, before initiation initiate of the new law, then the new law could not be applied to the defendant because it would violate ex post facto principle. Ex post facto principle states that defendant can only be punished under the law that was in effect at the time when the inmate or defendant committed criminal behavior. So the defendant punishment could not be increased if stricter laws are passed after the defendant committed prohibited conduct. If the defendant received a harsher penalty based on a law that was passed after the commission of the defendant offense, defendant in such a case may have valid constitutional claim. طيب السؤال الأخير اللي احنا هنتناوله في النقطة دي فيما يتعلق لو صدر قانون جديد، لو صدر قانون جديد، القانون الجديد ده اوكي وضع شروط او ضوابط للجود تايم كريدت، اوكي، تخلي الانميت ده في حالة أسوأ، بمعنى انه ما يطبقش عليه نفس الرولز، او انه يصدر قانون مش في مصلحته فيما يتعلق بالبينال تريتمنت. هيطبق؟ لا، لان هنا عندنا قاعده دستوريه اسمها اكس بوست فاكتو، عدم رجعيه القانون. وبالتالي لا يجوز تطبيق القانون الجديد. يعني هو ارتكب جريمه وخد عقوبه، العقوبه دي اثناء فتره تنفيذها عشان ياخد الجود تايم كريدت، صدر قانون تاني يخليه لا في موقف أسوأ. لا، لا يطبق القانون في هذه الجديد في هذه الحالة، لا يطبق إلا القانون السابق، لأنه هو هنا القانون اللي ارتكب الجريمة في ظله، إلا إذا كان هذا القانون الجديد يقرر مركز قانوني هنا أصلح للمتهم فيطبق استثناء. هذا فيما يتعلق بالايرلي ريليس. قبل ما نتكلم في الكونديشنال ريليس، حد عنده اي سؤال او اي استفسار؟